in my title to the second part of my talk, I'm borrowing a phrase from the core values of the Correctional Service of Canada. Relationship is the cornerstone to correction. In the next few minutes, I want to address that good question that emerges from Mr. Muse's editorial and suggest an answer that is rooted in personal experience. I will argue that relationship is a means by which we will know one another, understand one another, trust one another. I'm not suggesting for a moment that relationship is a substitute for rigorous assessment or for carefully designed programming, but rather a beginning point for each. In my estimation, what's so dangerous about the sloppy, politically motivated language that surrounds the real problem of terrorism is that it obscures what we should know and proposes instead emotionally guided gut reactions that in many instances slide in the direction of structural injustice and lies. If human history tells us anything, it tells us that lasting peace and security have never been built on the back of structural injustice and lies. My colleagues and I first heard about Omar Khadar's story in September of 2008. We were holding our semi-annual Interdisciplinary Studies conference at the King's University, which, by the way, we were doing again today. Among the many speakers who addressed the audience was Mr. Dennis Edney, Omar's Canadian attorney. Many of you may know parts of Omar's story. His name appears regularly in the paper, most recently last weekend, in connection with his impending bail hearing, when the Government of Canada, following now a long-established pattern, once again called him a radicalized, violent terrorist. In brief, Omar is the young Canadian who was picked up on a battlefield in Afghanistan in 2002. He was accused of having thrown a grenade that killed an American soldier, a father of two, Sergeant First Class Christopher Spear. Omar was 15 years old. Although there are laws and practices that insist Omar should have been labeled a child soldier and placed in care, not in prison, Omar was brutally interrogated and abused by his American captors, both in Bagram and later in Guantanamo Bay. He was held for years without charge. He was accused and convicted of murder in violation of the rules of war by the infamous Guantanamo Military Tribunal. His conviction marked the first time that a teen had been convicted of war crimes in the United States. Omar's conviction placed him in the company of Nazi camp commanders from World War II. How a teen on a battlefield can be treated this way has baffled many. Laws in most civilized nations would prevent it. Certainly the laws in the United States and Canada do. But while the military tribunal is run by the US military, it does not obey US law. All of the charges used against Omar were devised after the fact and applied retroactively. All of Omar's convictions, by the way, are currently under appeal in the United States. This is just the tip of the iceberg for his story, and if you're not familiar with it, the tale is really worth your time. When students and faculty first heard Mr. Edney tell Omar's story, they were amazed and distressed. At the conclusion of Mr. Edney's talk, faculty reminded students that they'd heard an advocate and a powerful one. We encouraged students to go out and learn all they could from every other point of view. Once they had done this, we invited them to come back, and if they wanted to do something, we promised we'd help them. We would not be helpless or hopeless. And so an odyssey of student learning began, and a series of activities ensued. Students staged a large public information, several of them, that drew big crowds and national media attention. They also wrote letters to Omar. I did too. Eventually, at the invitation of Mr. Edney, my letters became lessons. 2 years later, when Omar's case was settled by plea deal, This educational relationship with Omar led to an invitation for me to address the Guantanamo Military Commission at a hearing that preceded Omar's sentencing. This appearance, in turn, generated a request by the U.S. military to devise an educational curriculum to carry Omar through the last 2 of his 10 full years of incarceration at Guantanamo. So from November of 2010 to the present, my colleagues and I have been teaching Omar via email, snail mail, and now in person at Bowdoin Institution. Through this relationship, we've come to know Omar and know him well. Our voices have been added to Mr. Edney's and to the many others who have testified about who Omar really is. Omar has earned the good opinion of most of those who have spent time with him. Are there detractors? Yes, a few. But the most vocal of these have spent no more than a few hours with Omar, and these under hostile conditions. On the other hand, the list of those who have known Omar for years and who speak well of him is impressive. For example, U.S. military judge Patrick McCarthy, the prison camp commander at Guantanamo, who testified on Omar's behalf at the military tribunal. Retired Brigadier General Stephen Xenakis, a doctor of adolescent psychiatry who worked with Omar for years while he was in Cuba and who now pays his own way to come and work with Omar here in Canada. Psychologist Catherine Porterfield, a New York-based trauma specialist who also spent years working with Omar in Guantanamo and who also pays her way to come and visit him here in Alberta. More recently, Correctional Service of Canada personnel have added their voice to the chorus. So in direct answer to Mr. Muse's question about Omar, I say, look at the evidence. It's on the public record. When virtually all who know the young person testify to his health, thoughtfulness, peaceful nature, and desire to make a positive contribution to Canadian life, one would think that this testimony would have weight. But for Mr. Muse and for the Government of Canada, it does not. My point is simply this. We need to be thoughtful. We need to employ best practices. We need to strive for a politic of virtue where, like the Correctional Service of Canada, we seek to correct, to renew, and to reconcile those who find themselves on the wrong side of the law. Does this mean that we ignore victims? Of course not. On the contrary, the injunction to reach out to one another in relationship, to make the time, to invest ourselves, is precisely what is needed for both offender and victim. Revenge destroys those who grieve, and revenge seems to be exactly what is on offer for today's victims of crime. Tonight's gathering is hosted by the Interfaith Chaplaincy, so it seems appropriate to remind one another that our faith traditions teach us virtue, the pursuit of the good and the beautiful. They remind us to see one another as fellow human beings and to answer fear, hatred, ignorance with courage, charity, and wisdom. They underscore the truth that we exist in relationship and that when things go wrong, the whole system is affected. Tough on crime strategies that throw people away are not only fiscally irresponsible, they don't work. There are alternatives, but they will ask something of us. In conclusion, I propose that people of faith may need to be more radical about their faith commitments. We will also need to be especially attentive to the way we use and interpret language, the word. George Orwell reminds us that the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts. And in this time of stress and uncertainty, we need all the wisdom we can gather. Thank you.